It was the most uncomfortable briefing room in the entire Vietnam War. In September 1967, an Australian SAS sergeant sat in the back row of a classified tactical lecture at Fort Sherman, Panama, the United States Army's premier jungle operations training center, and did something no foreign observer was supposed to do. He laughed, not a polite chuckle, not a suppressed grin, a full, involuntary bark of disbelief that stopped the American instructor mid-sentence. The sergeant had been sent to Panama as part of a military exchange program, an Australian representative invited to observe American jungle warfare training methods and offer professional commentary. He had spent the previous 3 years rotating through the most hostile jungle environments on Earth, from the rainforests of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation to the rubber plantations and triple canopy nightmare of Phuoc Tuy Province in Vietnam. He had personally conducted over 40 long-range reconnaissance patrols behind enemy lines. He had killed men at distances measured in arm lengths. He had lived for weeks in jungle so dense that sunlight never reached the forest floor, moving at speed so slow they could be measured in meters per hour. And now, a freshly starched American captain was explaining to a room full of soldiers how to cross a river using a rope and pulley system. The Australian turned to the British SAS liaison officer sitting next to him and whispered 7 words that would eventually find their way into a classified assessment of Allied training disparities. They don't train for war here, they train for camping. He was being harsh. He was also being accurate, because what was happening at Fort Sherman and at every American jungle training facility from Okinawa to Hawaii was not preparation for the war being fought in Vietnam. It was preparation for a war that existed only in American doctrinal manuals, a war where the jungle was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a weapon to be wielded. And the difference between those two philosophies was being measured every single day in body bags. To understand why Australian Special Forces regarded American jungle training with something between pity and professional contempt, you have to understand where both traditions came from. And you have to understand that by the time the first American combat units waded ashore at Da Nang in March 1965, the Australians had already been fighting and winning jungle wars for over 20 years. The roots of Australian jungle warfare ran deeper than any training program could replicate. They ran all the way back to 1942, to a place called Kokoda, where Australian soldiers fought the Japanese Imperial Army along a narrow jungle track through the Owen Stanley Range of Papua New Guinea. That campaign nearly destroyed the Australian Army. Entire battalions were chewed apart by an enemy that understood the jungle in ways Australians did not. Men died of malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus in numbers that rivaled combat casualties. Units became lost in terrain so disorienting that patrols sometimes walked in circles for days. The jungle swallowed everything the Australians threw at it: their tactics, their confidence, their assumptions about what Western soldiers could accomplish in tropical warfare. But Australia learned, not in the cautious institutional way that large militaries usually absorb lessons, through committees and white papers and revised field manuals published years after the fighting ends. Australia learned the way organisms learn from near-extinction events immediately, desperately, and with a cellular permanence that altered the nation's military DNA. In November 1942, while the Kokoda campaign was still being fought, the Australian Army established the Land Headquarters Training Centre for Jungle Warfare at Canungra, in the rainforests of southeast Queensland. The founding directive was blunt. Every soldier going to the Pacific would pass through Kokoda, no exceptions. The curriculum would be built not from textbooks, but from the reports of men who were fighting and dying in New Guinea at that very moment. Instructors would be combat veterans rotated directly from the front lines. The training would replicate actual jungle conditions as closely as possible because the Australian High Command had learned something that would take the American military another 25 years to understand. You cannot prepare men for the jungle by lecturing them about the jungle. You prepare them by putting them in it. By mid-1943, Kokoda was processing 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers at a time. The training was savage by any contemporary standard. Men marched for days through mountainous rainforest carrying full combat loads. They navigated without maps through terrain deliberately chosen for its disorienting sameness. They conducted live-fire exercises at distances that would have been considered reckless at any American training facility. They slept in the rain, ate unfamiliar food, and endured insects and leeches and tropical heat until the jungle stopped being alien and started becoming familiar. The goal was not toughness for its own sake. The goal was transformation. Kokoda's instructors, men who had watched their friends die at Kokoda because they did not understand the environment they were fighting in, designed a program that broke soldiers out of their Western assumptions about warfare and rebuilt them as creatures adapted to jungle reality. A soldier who graduated from Kokoda did not fear the jungle. He understood it. He could read it the way a farmer reads weather, sensing changes in humidity, interpreting bird calls, detecting human presence through disturbances in the insect soundscape. This was not mysticism. This was survival methodology, refined through catastrophic failure and passed forward with the urgency of men who knew that inadequate preparation was a death sentence. When the war ended, Kokoda closed temporarily. But when the Malayan emergency erupted in 1948, threatening British colonial holdings in Southeast Asia with communist insurgency, Australia reopened the facility in 1954 and began the next phase of its jungle warfare education. The Malayan emergency was a different kind of war than Kokoda. The enemy was not a conventional army, but a guerrilla force, the Malayan Communist Party, that operated in small cells within jungle so thick that the British initially considered it impenetrable. The Communists used the jungle as sanctuary, emerging to ambush convoys and assassinate officials before dissolving back into vegetation that defied pursuit. The British struggled. Their initial response was massive sweeps through jungle terrain, operations involving hundreds of soldiers crashing through undergrowth, finding nothing, and returning exhausted and demoralized while the guerrillas watched them from concealed positions 100 meters away. It was the same pattern that would later define American operations in Vietnam, and it failed for the same reasons. The Australians who deployed to Malaya, particularly the battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, brought Kokoda's lessons with them and then expanded upon them. They studied the enemy's methods rather than dismissing them. They learned to move through jungle with a patience that the British found exasperating and the Communists found terrifying. They adopted small patrol tactics, sending 4 or 5 men into areas where the British had used entire companies. They prioritized silence over speed, concealment over firepower, intelligence over aggression. Over the 12 years of the emergency, Australian forces developed a counterinsurgency methodology that treated the jungle not as hostile territory to be conquered, but as an operational environment to be mastered. The jungle was neutral. It punished the ignorant and rewarded the knowledgeable regardless of which flag they fought under. The Australians made themselves knowledgeable. The kill ratios reflected this, the casualty figures confirmed it, and the institutional memory preserved it, passed from Kanungra-trained veterans to the next generation of soldiers preparing for the next jungle war. That next war came in 1963 in the jungles of Borneo. The Indonesian confrontation, or konfrontasi, pitted Commonwealth forces against Indonesian-backed insurgents along the border between Malaysian Borneo and Indonesian Kalimantan. The terrain was among the most challenging on Earth. Mountainous primary jungle covering an island the size of South Australia, laced with rivers, ridgelines, and vegetation so dense that helicopter landing zones had to be cut by hand. President Sukarno of Indonesia was determined to prevent the formation of the Malaysian Federation, and his forces began sending insurgents across the border from Kalimantan to raid towns, police stations, and army bases in North Borneo and Sarawak. What followed was a conflict that most of the world barely noticed, and that shaped the future of jungle warfare more profoundly than any other engagement of the Cold War. The Australian SAS received its first operational deployment during the confrontation. The first SAS soldiers reached Brunei in February 1965, and for the next year and a half they conducted operations that would become the blueprint for everything they did in Vietnam. Borneo was the proving ground. It was also the crucible. SAS patrols in Borneo lasted weeks, sometimes months. One patrol endured for 89 days without resupply, a feat that strains comprehension. 89 days of living on short rations, moving through terrain that reduced daily progress to agonizing increments, sleeping in the rain, enduring leeches and fire ants, and sandflies that inflicted bites that swelled into infected sores. The soldiers carried everything they needed on their backs. There were no forward operating bases, no helicopter resupply, no hot meals delivered by logistics teams. They ate what they carried, and, when that ran out, what they could find. The SAS conducted reconnaissance and ambush operations deep inside Indonesian territory under operations codenamed Claret, mission so secret that the Australian government denied their existence for decades. Small teams, often just 4 or 5 men, crossed the border into Kalimantan, penetrated Indonesian-held territory, gathered intelligence, and conducted ambushes against Indonesian forces that had no idea Commonwealth troops were operating in their rear area. The patrols were conducted entirely on foot, without resupply, and in terrain where discovery meant death or capture far behind enemy lines, with no possibility of rescue. The first member of the SAS to die on active service in Borneo was killed not by the enemy, but by a rogue elephant. Lance Corporal Paul Dennehy suffered an agonizing death in the jungle, wounded by an elephant's tusk, enduring unimaginable pain for days before he died. The jungle in Borneo was not merely hostile terrain. It was alive, and it killed the unprepared with the same indifference it showed to all intruders, regardless of uniform. During their time in Borneo, the Australian SAS conducted more than 40 patrols on both sides of the border, nearly half solely for reconnaissance. Veterans who later served in Vietnam remembered Borneo as having been far more physically demanding, owing mainly to the nature of the terrain, the extraordinary length of the patrols, and the constant need to survive on minimal rations. But Borneo proved to be an invaluable proving ground. The regiment entered Borneo as a unit without combat experience. It emerged as something approaching a specialized jungle warfare organism, an institution that understood the jungle on a level that no training school alone could produce. In Borneo, the SAS learned lessons about long-duration jungle operations that no training school could teach. They learned what happens to the human body after 3 weeks without proper hygiene, how the mind adapts to constant threat, how small teams develop communication systems so refined that entire tactical plans can be conveyed through a touch on the shoulder or a shift in breathing. They learned that the jungle rewards those who submit to its rhythms and punishes those who try to impose their own. By the time Australia committed forces to Vietnam in 1962, beginning with the 30 men of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam under Colonel Ted Sarong, the country possessed something no other Western military could claim: an unbroken chain of institutional jungle warfare knowledge stretching back through Borneo, Malaya, and the blood-soaked tracts of Papua New Guinea. 3 generations of soldiers had fought, adapted, and transmitted hard-won knowledge forward. The men who arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 carried the accumulated wisdom of 24 years of continuous jungle warfare evolution. Now, consider what the Americans brought. The United States military had its own jungle warfare history, but it was a history marked by gaps, institutional amnesia, and a persistent belief that technology could substitute for environmental adaptation. American soldiers had fought in the Pacific jungles during the Second World War, and they had suffered terribly for their inexperience. Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Burma, the Philippines, each campaign taught brutal lessons about the costs of jungle ignorance. But when the war ended, the American military did what large institutions often do with uncomfortable knowledge. It filed the lessons away and moved on to the next priority. The Korean War was fought in mountains and rice paddies, not jungles. The Cold War focused American military planning on a potential armored confrontation in Western Europe, tank battles across the plains of Germany, nuclear exchanges between superpowers. Jungle warfare dropped from the priority list. The institutional knowledge atrophied. The veterans who had learned through suffering in the Pacific retired or died. Their replacements trained for the war the Pentagon expected, not the war that was coming. The formal centerpiece of American jungle training was the Jungle Operations Training Center at Fort Sherman, Panama. Established in 1953 near the Caribbean end of the Panama Canal, the facility occupied a patch of Central American jungle that bore a superficial resemblance to Southeast Asian terrain. Around 9,000 soldiers passed through the course each year during the Vietnam era. They spent approximately 2 weeks learning the basics of jungle survival, movement, and small unit tactics. They rappelled from helicopters, crossed rivers, identified poisonous snakes, built shelters, and conducted patrol exercises through the surrounding forest. The soldiers called it the Green Hell, and it was genuinely difficult training. The heat was relentless, the insects were enormous, the snakes were real, and men occasionally suffered serious injuries on the obstacle courses and river crossings. Graduating soldiers earned the Jungle Expert Tab, a qualification badge that signified completion of the course. But what Fort Sherman taught and what the jungle of Vietnam demanded were separated by a chasm that no 2-week course could bridge. The Green Hell taught soldiers how to survive the jungle. It did not teach them how to become part of it. The distinction sounds philosophical. It was lethally practical. American jungle training emphasized overcoming the environment. Soldiers learned to hack through vegetation with machetes, to build shelters that kept them dry, to identify which plants were poisonous and which animals were dangerous. They practiced rappelling from helicopters into jungle clearings. They learned river-crossing techniques using ropes and improvised flotation devices. They ran obstacle courses through mud and undergrowth until their muscles screamed. They conducted escape and evasion exercises where instructors posing as enemy combatants hunted them through the Panamanian forest. They identified venomous pit vipers, bushmasters, and enormous boa constrictors that lurked in the undergrowth and draped from trees above the trail. One National Guard sergeant reportedly captured and killed a 15-foot snake during his rotation. All of this was real. All of it was difficult, and none of it addressed the fundamental problem of how a Western soldier fights an insurgent enemy on that enemy's home terrain. The jungle at Fort Sherman was framed as an adversary, a hostile environment to be endured while you conducted military operations. The training manual listed over 100 varieties of poisonous or injurious flora. Crocodiles inhabited the nearby waterways. The mosquitoes carried malaria. The humidity rotted equipment and blistered skin. Soldiers were taught to overcome these obstacles through physical toughness and practical knowledge, the same approach you might take to surviving a particularly hostile expedition. The assumption underlying every lesson was that the soldier remained fundamentally unchanged by the jungle. He entered it as an American soldier, endured its hardships, completed his mission, and extracted. And there was another problem, one that would haunt American preparedness for decades. The course lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prepare a soldier for an environment where his enemy had been living, fighting, and perfecting his craft for a generation. 2 weeks to learn lessons that the Australians spent 18 months teaching their SAS candidates. 2 weeks to absorb skills that Aboriginal trackers had refined over 400 centuries. The mathematics of preparation were catastrophically unbalanced. The Marines had their own jungle training facility at Camp Gonsalves in northern Okinawa, established in 1958 as a counter-guerrilla school. The terrain was different from Vietnam, subtropical evergreen forest rather than tropical triple canopy, but the training philosophy was identical. Learn to survive the jungle. Learn to operate in the jungle. The jungle is the obstacle. You are the soldier. Your job is to accomplish the mission despite the jungle. Australian doctrine started from the opposite assumption entirely. The jungle was not the enemy. The jungle was the operating environment, and the soldier who refused to adapt to it was already dead. Australian training did not teach men to overcome the jungle. It taught them to disappear into it. This was not a subtle difference in emphasis. It was a fundamental divergence in philosophy that produced completely different soldiers. Consider the matter of hygiene. At Fort Sherman, soldiers maintained standard field sanitation procedures. They shaved. They used insect repellent. They wore regulation boots with distinctive tread patterns. They carried and consumed American rations that included items with strong chemical signatures, canned goods, processed foods, coffee. These practices were mandated by Army regulations and reinforced by a military culture that associated personal cleanliness with discipline and professionalism. At Kokoda and in the Australian SAS training pipeline, soldiers learned to abandon these practices entirely before entering operational jungle environments. They stopped using soap, deodorant, and commercial toothpaste weeks before a patrol. They switched from military boots to sandals that left tracks indistinguishable from local civilian or enemy footwear. They consumed indigenous foods, including fermented fish sauce, that altered their body chemistry until their scent blended with the jungle itself. They let their bodies become part of the environment because captured enemy documents and interrogation reports confirmed repeatedly and unambiguously, that the chemical signature of American hygiene products could be detected by experienced Viet Cong scouts from distances exceeding 500 meters. The Americans knew this. Intelligence reports documenting enemy detection of American scent signatures were circulated through MACV channels, but the institutional response was not to change hygiene practices. It was to develop better camouflage face paint and more effective insect repellent, a technological solution to a problem that required behavioral adaptation. The gap between the two approaches was not technological. It was cultural. American military culture in the 1960s was built on assumptions that had served brilliantly in the Second World War and Korea: speed, aggression, overwhelming firepower, technological superiority. These principles had destroyed the Wehrmacht and held the Chinese at the 38th parallel. They represented the distilled experience of the most powerful military force in human history, and they were reinforced by every layer of American military education, from basic training to the War College. The Vietnam War should have been the signal to rethink these assumptions. But institutions do not rethink assumptions easily, especially when those assumptions are the foundation of the institution's identity. The American military was not merely an organization that used firepower and technology. It was an organization that believed in firepower and technology the way a religion believes in its scripture. To question whether more bombs could solve the problem was to question the institution itself. When these principles collided with the realities of Vietnamese jungle warfare, the result was not adaptation, it was escalation. If patrols were being ambushed, send larger patrols with more radios and more automatic weapons. If larger patrols were being detected, add helicopter gunship support and pre-planned artillery fire. If artillery was not hitting the enemy, call in more artillery from positions further away. If bombing was not destroying jungle sanctuaries, drop more bombs from higher altitudes. The institutional reflex was to apply more force, more technology, more resources to a problem that required less force, more patience, and fundamental rethinking of how soldiers interacted with the environment. The consequences were visible to anyone willing to look. American patrols moved through the jungle in platoon or company strength, dozens or hundreds of men pushing through vegetation that no large group could penetrate quietly. They used machetes to cut trails, creating noise that carried hundreds of meters through the understory. They moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day, a pace that seemed cautiously professional by Western standards, but that left disturbance signatures as readable as a highway to any experienced tracker. Their boots left distinctive tread patterns in soft earth. Their C-ration cans and cigarette butts marked their campsites. Their radio chatter, even encrypted, created electronic signatures that direction-finding equipment could locate. They were, in the language of one Australian assessment, broadcasting their presence across every available sensory channel simultaneously. The Viet Cong did not need sophisticated surveillance technology to find American patrols. They needed ears, noses, and eyes, the same senses that any competent jungle hunter had possessed since the beginning of human history. American doctrine had produced soldiers who could not be missed. General William Westmoreland, commanding Military Assistance Command Vietnam, reportedly told Australian Brigadier Stuart Graham that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. The criticism was revealing. From Westmoreland's perspective, the Australians were underperforming because they were not generating the body counts and large-scale engagements that American doctrine considered indicators of success. The Australians were instead sending out small patrols that moved quietly through the landscape, making contact on their own terms, avoiding the set-piece battles that produced impressive statistics but rarely achieved lasting results. The American measure of success, the body count, was apparently held in contempt by many Australian battalion commanders who understood that killing 50 enemy soldiers in a battle that cost you 10 of your own was not victory. It was arithmetic without strategy. The American approach produced a specific pattern that the Viet Cong learned to exploit with mechanical efficiency. Large units would insert by helicopter, creating noise signatures detectable from kilometers away. The sound of approaching Hueys announced American intentions as clearly as a telegram. The enemy had studied these patterns for years before the 1st Marine Battalions waded ashore at Da Nang. They knew how long it took for artillery support to arrive. They knew which routes helicopters would follow. They knew how American units would react when ambushed, where the landing zones would be established, and how long they had to inflict casualties before withdrawing through prepared routes. When American soldiers arrived in Vietnam, many had passed through Fort Sherman or received jungle familiarization training at bases in Okinawa or Hawaii. They knew how to build a shelter. They knew which snakes were venomous. They could navigate using a compass and conduct basic patrol formations. What they did not know was how to become invisible. They did not know how to move through triple canopy jungle at 100 meters per hour, freezing between steps, scanning with their eyes without turning their heads, testing the air through subtle changes in breathing. They did not know how to read the jungle's acoustic environment, how to detect the absence of bird calls that indicated another human presence, how to interpret the behavior of insects disturbed by movement in the undergrowth. They did not know these things because no American training program taught them. Fort Sherman taught survival. The Australians taught predation. The Australian SAS selection and training pipeline was a different species of preparation entirely. It began not with physical testing, but with psychological evaluation. The regiment was looking for a specific cognitive profile: men with high pain tolerance, low need for external validation, exceptional pattern recognition, and what military psychologists described as predatory patience. The ability to remain absolutely still for hours while maintaining total sensory awareness. The willingness to transition from perfect stillness to explosive violence without the hesitation that normal human psychology imposes between these states. Only one candidate in 12 who began Australian SAS selection completed it. Those who survived entered a training program that lasted 18 months, 3 times the length of American Special Forces training of the same era. A significant portion of that training took place not in classrooms or on firing ranges, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking and concealment techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose people had been reading terrain for over 40,000 years. The Aboriginal contribution to Australian jungle warfare methodology was not a footnote. It was foundational. Aboriginal Australians had survived in some of the most unforgiving wilderness on Earth by developing sensory and tracking capabilities that Western science has only recently begun to quantify. Aboriginal trackers could determine from a footprint not merely direction of travel, but approximate weight, whether the person was carrying a load, whether they were injured, how long ago they had passed, and often whether they were alert or relaxed. They could read broken vegetation with the precision of a scientist reading instruments. They could detect human presence through environmental absence, noticing when birds had gone silent, or insects had altered their behavior in patterns that indicated intrusion. These were not mystical skills. They were the product of 40,000 years of evolutionary pressure, techniques refined across 400 centuries because the practitioners who mastered them survived, and those who did not were eliminated before they could pass their knowledge on. It was the longest continuous tradition of wilderness tracking and concealment anywhere on Earth, and the Australian SAS integrated it directly into operational doctrine. American military training had no equivalent foundation. There were proposals noted in classified assessments as late as 1974 to develop similar programs using Native American trackers. The proposals were submitted. They were never implemented. When Australian SAS operators deployed to Vietnam, the gap between their preparation and American preparation was not measured in degrees. It was measured in kind. American-trained soldiers entered the jungle as soldiers operating in an unfamiliar environment. Australian-trained operators entered the jungle as predators occupying their natural habitat. The operational results were documented in reports that American commanders found difficult to reconcile with their own experience. Australian SAS patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province achieved kill ratios that senior American officers initially dismissed as fabrication. Over the 5 years of SAS operations, approximately 580 soldiers conducted over 1,100 patrols, the vast majority being reconnaissance or ambush operations. They operated from the top of the Nui Dat feature known as SAS Hill and built a reputation that extended well beyond the Australian area of operations. The SAS approach in Vietnam was a direct evolution of everything learned at Kanungra in Malaya and in Borneo. Patrols typically consisted of 5 men. They moved on foot, often walking in from kilometers away, rather than using helicopter insertion, which announced their presence to every enemy scout within earshot. When helicopters were used, elaborate deception plans masked the actual insertion point. Multiple false insertions, diversionary flights, and careful timing made it impossible for the enemy to determine where the patrol had actually entered the jungle. Once on the ground, the patrols moved at speeds that defied American comprehension. 100 meters per hour was standard. Some patrols covered even less. The point man would take a single step, placing his foot with surgical precision on ground that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol would freeze, complete stillness for minutes at a time. During those minutes, the soldiers scanned their surroundings, using only their eyes, never turning their heads. They tested the air through subtle nostril movements, reading scent the way a predator reads prey. They listened with an intensity that processed every sound the jungle produced, cataloging the normal and flagging the anomalous. After minutes of this absolute stillness, another step, another freeze, another cycle of sensory collection that transformed the patrol from intruders into sensors, organic surveillance platforms that moved through the jungle without disturbing it. The patience required for this was not merely physical discipline, it was psychological transformation. A soldier moving at conventional speeds thinks about his destination, about the next waypoint, about the operation's timeline. He projects forward mentally, and that projection creates subtle behavioral cues, a slight lean in the direction of travel, a marginal increase in movement tempo as the objective approaches, micro-expressions of anticipation or anxiety. These cues are invisible to untrained observers. They are neon signs to an experienced jungle scout. The Australians trained themselves to eliminate these cues entirely. They existed in a state of pure sensory awareness, perceiving without interpreting, observing without planning, responding without deliberating. They did not think about where they were going. They experienced where they were. And this seemingly philosophical distinction had lethal practical consequences because an enemy scout looking at a concealed Australian position detected nothing to investigate. There were no behavioral signals to trigger suspicion. The human in that position had temporarily ceased generating the behavioral radiation that marks every conscious, intentional human being. American soldiers who served alongside Australian SAS operators frequently reported the same observation. The Australians moved differently. They occupied space differently. Their relationship with the jungle environment was fundamentally unlike anything in American military experience. They did not fight the jungle. They used it. They did not merely hide in it. They became it, to the point where Viet Cong soldiers could pass within meters of concealed Australian positions and detect nothing unusual. The U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, had candidly admitted at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra as early as May 1962 that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. Australia's initial contribution to Vietnam, the 30 advisors of the AATTV, was specifically intended to address this knowledge gap. Colonel Ted Sarong and his team were experts in counterinsurgency and jungle operations, most having served during the Malayan emergency. They were, in effect, the institutional memory of 20 years of jungle warfare, sent to help an ally that had lost its own institutional memory decades earlier. But Sarong discovered what the Australian SAS sergeant would later confirm at Fort Sherman. The problem was not that Americans lacked information about jungle warfare. The problem was that American military culture was structurally incapable of absorbing the lessons being offered. When Sarong questioned the strategic Hamlet program at a counterinsurgency meeting in Washington in 1963, he drew a violent challenge from a U.S. Marine general. The information was unwelcome not because it was incorrect, but because it contradicted assumptions embedded so deeply in American doctrine that questioning them felt like questioning the institution itself. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Individual Americans recognized the superiority of Australian methods. Officers who served alongside Australian units advocated for adoption of their tactics. Classified reports recommended changes to American training programs that reflected Australian experience. The recommendations were filed, stamped, and buried. The Pentagon was not interested in evidence suggesting that a force of fewer than 8,000 Australians was achieving results that 500,000 Americans could not match. The captured enemy documents told the story that American institutions refused to hear. Viet Cong tactical guidance distinguished explicitly between fighting Americans and fighting Australians. Against Americans, the guidance was confident, almost procedural. Ambush at selected locations, inflict casualties in the first 30 seconds, withdraw before artillery becomes effective. American movement was predictable, their presence easily detected, their response patterns well understood. Against Australians, the guidance was something else entirely. Avoid contact. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush because the Australians were more likely to detect the trap than to walk into it. Do not pursue because Australian counter-tracking capabilities made pursuit dangerous. If contact was unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The Viet Cong had a word for the Australian operators: Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural weight, tapping into Vietnamese folklore about forest spirits that could not be seen, could not be tracked, and killed without warning. The fear was not theatrical. It was operational. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy Province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American formations in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. One former Viet Cong leader, quoted after the war, offered an assessment that distilled the entire training disparity into a handful of sentences. The Americans would strike, then call for aircraft and artillery. The Viet Cong response was to break contact and disappear. But the Australians were more patient, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They preferred to stay with the enemy instead of calling in firepower. The Viet Cong were more afraid of the Australian approach. This was the verdict that Fort Sherman's 2-week course could never address. This was the gap that no amount of river-crossing exercises or snake identification briefings could close. The Americans trained soldiers to endure the jungle for the duration of an operation. The Australians trained predators who inhabited the jungle as their operational domain, who moved through it at speeds that made them functionally invisible, who shed the scent signatures and noise signatures and visual signatures that betrayed every American patrol that entered the bush. When the war ended and the classified assessments were finally compiled, the conclusions were devastating to American institutional pride. The final American evaluation of Australian SAS operations, completed in 1974 and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, acknowledged that small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. It acknowledged that indigenous tracking methods provided intelligence capabilities no technology could replicate. It acknowledged that psychological operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects wildly disproportionate to resources invested. The report also noted in its classified annex that Australian methods achieved these results while operating under fewer restrictions than American forces, and that certain Australian practices would likely violate standing MACV directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. This final observation guaranteed that the report would remain classified for decades. The Pentagon had no desire to publicize the fact that its most effective allies succeeded partly by operating outside the boundaries American forces were required to observe. The legacy filtered slowly into American military practice. When the United States finally undertook serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, building Delta Force, expanding the SEAL teams, creating the modern architecture of unconventional warfare, the reforms incorporated principles that Australians had been demonstrating as effective since the mid-1960s. Small unit operations, emphasis on stealth over firepower, cultural adaptation, environmental integration, patience as a tactical weapon. These concepts, once dismissed as primitive by officers who prided themselves on helicopter mobility and artillery support, became cornerstones of American Special Operations doctrine. But the path from dismissal to adoption was not smooth. It was littered with casualties and missed opportunities. The Vietnam War proved such a traumatic experience for the American Army that for nearly 15 years after the conflict ended, virtually no aspect of the war was addressed in formal military education programs. The basic and advanced officer training courses at Fort Benning, the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, the war colleges, all of them avoided Vietnam as a subject of serious study until the 1980s. An entire generation of officers was trained without examining the most significant American military failure since the Civil War. The jungle warfare expertise that individual Americans had acquired through painful experience in Southeast Asia was allowed to decay. The specialized units created for jungle operations, the long-range reconnaissance patrols, and combat tracker teams were disbanded. The Special Forces and Rangers entered a period of temporary decline. The American military focused its institutional attention on the European battlefields, where NATO and the Warsaw Pact might someday clash. Armored warfare on the plains of Germany, a conflict that never came. Meanwhile, the Australians preserved their knowledge. Their jungle warfare training infrastructure at Canungra evolved but never disappeared. The Jungle Training Wing at Tully, in the tropical north of Queensland, continued producing soldiers who understood what it meant to operate in close country. The institutional memory survived because Australia's geography demanded it. The nation sat at the edge of the largest concentration of tropical jungle on Earth. Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, East Timor, the potential battlefields of Australia's future were all jungle environments. Forgetting was not an option, but the adoption by the Americans took decades. By some assessments, the delay in learning what the Australians were willing to teach contributed to casualties that better methods might have prevented. The lessons were available in 1966. The Australian AATTV was sharing knowledge from the day it arrived. The SAS demonstrated effective methodology on every patrol it conducted. The evidence was overwhelming, accessible, and offered freely to anyone willing to examine it. The institutions were not willing to learn, not because the men within them were stupid or indifferent, but because institutions change only when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. In Vietnam, that cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic failure that might have forced immediate reform. Each ambushed patrol was a separate incident. Each detected position was an individual failure attributable to local circumstances rather than systemic doctrine. The pattern was visible only in aggregate, in statistics that senior commanders had professional incentives not to examine closely. Fort Sherman closed in 1999 when the Panama Canal was returned to Panamanian control, part of the 1977 treaty negotiated by President Carter and General Omar Torrijos. The Jungle Operations Training Center was not relocated. The Defense Department closed it down without replacement, driven by budget cuts, a belief that jungle warfare was a relic of the past, and the growing institutional conviction that high-technology equipment would define future conflicts. For 15 years, the American military had no dedicated jungle warfare school at all. Soldiers seeking jungle training could obtain it only through small unit exchange programs with foreign militaries, sending a handful of men to learn in other countries what America had once taught on its own soil. When the course was finally re-established at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii in 2014, the Army sent soldiers to train with foreign partners, including Australians, to relearn skills that had been allowed to atrophy for an entire generation. The irony was remarkable. 50 years after the Australians first tried to teach American forces how to operate in the jungle, American forces were once again turning to the Australians for instruction. The cycle of institutional amnesia had completed a full revolution. The new course trained between 750 and 950 soldiers per year, a fraction of the 9,000 who had passed through Fort Sherman annually during the Vietnam era. It was 12 days long, shorter even than the 2-week Panama program that the Australian sergeant had dismissed as camping. And in 2025, the Pentagon began sending conventional forces back to Panama to train at the former Fort Sherman site, now a Panamanian naval base, acknowledging that the jungle training available in Hawaii was insufficient for the demands of potential future conflict in tropical environments. The Australian SAS sergeant who laughed in that Panama briefing room returned to Vietnam and completed 2 more tours. He survived the war. He carried the knowledge of Kokoda and Borneo and Malaya and 40,000 years of Aboriginal tracking tradition into the jungles of Phuoc Tuy, and he brought his men home alive. The American soldiers who completed their 2 weeks at the Green Hell deployed to a war that their training had not prepared them for. Many adapted through necessity, inventing solutions on the ground that their training had never anticipated. Many displayed extraordinary courage in circumstances that no briefing could have foreseen. Individual Americans figured out what the Australians already knew, that the jungle was not the problem, their approach to it was. But these individual insights rarely traveled upward through the chain of command. They remained local knowledge, unofficial adaptations that died when the soldiers who developed them rotated home. The difference was never about courage. It was never about individual capability or national character. It was about what happens when one military tradition invests decades in understanding an environment while another spends 2 weeks learning to tolerate it. It was about the gap between training for the jungle and training to be the jungle. The Australians closed that gap. The Americans, for all their power, their technology, their resources, their extraordinary bravery, never did. Not in Vietnam. Not until decades later, when the lessons written in blood finally became too expensive to ignore. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. They did not become ghosts through superior equipment or bigger budgets. They became ghosts because their entire military tradition, stretching back through Borneo and Malaya and Kokoda and 40 millennia of Aboriginal knowledge, taught them something that no 2-week course at Fort Sherman could convey. The jungle does not care what flag you carry. It does not care how many helicopters you can summon or how many tons of bombs you can drop. It rewards only those who learn its rules and punishes everyone else regardless of rank, resources, or national pride. The Australians learned the rules. They passed through Konungra's crucible. They absorbed Malaya's lessons. They survived Borneo's forge. They carried Aboriginal wisdom into a Western war. And when they entered the jungles of Vietnam, they did not enter as visitors. They entered as something the enemy had never encountered and could never defeat. They entered as ghosts. And somewhere in the archives of Fort Sherman, in the yellowed records of a jungle school that no longer exists, the assessment of that Australian sergeant still sits in a classified folder. 7 words that captured everything the American military refused to hear for decades. They don't train for war here. They train for camping. The jungle never forgot who was prepared and who was pretending. It never does.